Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in a church. You don't let the American flag touch the ground. You don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway. And since no one else was going, he managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends admit being asses to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourist knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This apparently was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason in this particular place you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually I had to urinate. I stepped off of the main road just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past a shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget, though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, and brush. But suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least, because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around as if they actually had been a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments. But we were there all day, and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that it was making far too much noise, and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off, or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time it was funny. "Hey, Buck. Yeah, you horny motherfucker, leave us alone." He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark," I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark?" I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far, I knew, because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed myself. There were other things too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. "Mark!" I called out furiously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward, along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it'd hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again. "Mark." Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself this wasn't real. At first, I saw a head, the head of a buck, but it came forward, and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared-looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of the average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked, with very human genitalia. Its penis was dripping blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and its legs. They started human, but near the bottom they started distorting and became animalistic. At the ends of its legs were powerful hooves. At the ends of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged at the horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang suddenly. It's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all my life, but it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it slightly. That's the only reason. I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually I didn't hear it anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up at the trail, at the point where it went up between two mountains and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there near the beginning of the trail was the Skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in dreams, nightmares, that creature, the Skinwalker. Somehow I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite, because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's raped and mutilated corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. My wife heard a skinwalker in our house last night. Let me start off by saying that my wife doesn't believe in paranormal entities or anything of that nature. We have 3 cats, and one of them likes to be a rebel, jumping onto counters and meowing at the top of his lungs, just looking for attention. He does this throughout the night, and it's a regular occurrence. Last night, after a few beers and video games, I decided it was time to head to bed with my wife. When I woke up this morning, my wife was basically attached to me with wide eyes and a nervous look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she proceeded to tell me what happened last night. She said that around 2:50 in the morning, she was woken up to a noise that sounded like one of our cats downstairs meowing unusually loud. After giving herself a few seconds to perk up and fully pay attention, she said that the meows sounded more like a person trying to mimic a cat, and it kept saying hello. After meowing for 2 to 3 minutes, a loud bang came at our door, and then a notification went off for a motion sensor at our front door. When she told me this, I checked my phone, and sure enough, there was a notification for motion detected at 2:52 a.m. I asked her why she didn't wake me up so I could grab my gun. She said she was frozen with fear and didn't want it to hear her make a noise. We're out running errands while I'm typing this, but something made me uncomfortable about her story. Last night, I set the home security alarm around 9 p.m., and we didn't turn it off till we walked the dog this morning. To make things worse, we had slept with all of the animals in the room and the door was closed, so whatever was in our house or outside the front door was not one of our animals. Obviously, the first thing that came to my mind was a skinwalker, but maybe I'm just being paranoid. I checked all the rooms in the house after I got up. I'm not sure what I could have done anyways. It's very odd that my wife was scared so badly by something she doesn't necessarily believe in. We bought this house brand new, so no one has lived here before. When I'm home alone, I do feel like I'm being watched, or someone's always walking directly behind me. My wife also said that the house has given her chills since we moved in. Something is just off about it. We just got home and I went to hang up one of my shirts in the master bedroom closet when I noticed that the board that covers the attic access has been shifted a little. When I asked my wife about it, she said she's never been up there, and the builders would have placed it back in its original place before we made the purchase. I'm genuinely getting anxious just thinking about what could be going on. Has anyone had an experience like this? Or similar, at least? We're going to my mother-in-law's to get some sage. My wife said burning it should keep whatever's around our house away. My grandfather told me a story once as we sat around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in a purple sky, with a full, fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide, dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, he began, I lived outside an Apache reservation with my grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside, with dirt good for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night my mother was sick and Pa and I took a trip into town about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some old abandoned farmsteads. The fire sparked and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. What next? I asked. Settle down, boy, you'll hear soon enough. Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember, too, when the engine began to sputter and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. God damn it, Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road as it coasted to a halt. Stay here, son, as he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too, the back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing and hung still and heavy, with the stink filling the cab. Pa, I called, Pa. No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. Boy, I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam, not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light across the partly open domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit off to his side, and he looked pensively into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweating and clammy. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legends say. maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma," as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out onto the road, and our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. "But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom?" "No, boy, I knew because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next us, boy." My pa kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward. "Son," he said, "don't look at it. Don't look at it. That's how I knew, boy.